with the last two Korean teams, Freaka Freaks and Katie Rolster, eliminated in the round of 8, the quarterfinal of the Season 8 World Championship. This was the worst finish for Korea as a region in the history of Worlds. They played from Season 2 Worlds onwards up to Season 8. Their previous worst finish for a Korean team, in terms of the #1 Korean team overall, was they'd made it to the final of Season 2 Worlds. The next 5 Worlds after that, Season 3 to Season 7, the champions of Worlds were always Korean. The last 3 finals, Season 5, Season 6, Season 7, both participants in the final were Korean. And in fact, you could go back to the years before that, Season 4 and Season 3, and make a very strong case that if the brackets had been differently, we'd have had all Korean finalists there. Najin Sword against SK Telecom, Samsung White against Samsung Blue. Korean teams at all the previous Worlds had made the playoffs in their entirety. All 3 teams, all 2, if you go back to Season 2 Worlds, had always made the playoffs of Worlds. This time around, that's another record that gets snapped. Gen.G went out not only without getting out of the group, but in last place from their group. So let's consider this. First of all, let's look at the idea of like, how bad is this? So I will say, I do think people are overreacting. Now, you can't overreact in as much as when you just look at those placings and those streaks that have ended that I just referred to. That obviously can't really, you can't justify that. You can't say this was in any way a decent or a good Worlds for Korea. But when I say people are overreacting, I mean because people are pushing it not from like, wow, Katie Rolster didn't do as well as I thought. What the hell happened to our Freaka Freaks, Gen.G, whatsoever? They're not looking at the teams. They're doing the whole regional angle. So just as people are really overplaying North America's contribution, by the way, a team that absolutely could not win the NALCS is the one that's gone the furthest. And so NA's doing well. It's like, where the fuck are the other NA teams? Likewise, people are going too far the other way on the Korean teams. So if their worst ever Worlds is still 2 out of the 3 teams making playoffs, and in fact being favoured to win their playoff series and at least make the semis, that's still pretty decent. Like, they're still a pretty fucking good region if that's their like worst Worlds ever by far. Then when people are saying like NA outperformed Korea, not really. I mean, Cloud9 did in a sense. Cloud9 beat a Freaka Freaks in a series, sure, great performance. Didn't play, obviously beat Gen.G, there you go, another great performance. They didn't play Katie Rolster though. They finished worse in their group than Katie Rolster did in their own group. Katie Rolster topped their group. And so it's not like C9 has actually been better than Katie Rolster at this Worlds. No, what happened is C9 got a nice bracket draw, got the right opponent, got an opponent from a group itself, which had been very much in flux, and therefore ended up playing against a Freaka Freaks. If they'd have drawn Katie Rolster, which they could have done, I think Cloud9 probably gets dusted off, and then this whole narrative of like NA outperformed Korea would be, I mean, rightfully dead. They did overall, in terms of placing, it's inarguable. But the idea that not only is Korea doing badly, but NA is doing so well the other side, that is overplayed. Now, to be fair, Korea can get unfair groups as well at Worlds. Like, I would argue that Gen.G getting group, I think it was group B in the end, right? The one that had C9, RNG, and who was the other team? C9, RNG... Oh, Vitality. I would say that's a very unfair group, especially for a team in the Freaka Freaks who, by all rights, if I was doing seeding, would be like minimum top 5 team in the tournament. So there's no way they would get a group like that with traditional seeding system. So that can happen to Koreans as well. It's just that, first of all, except for Gen.G, there wasn't really any unfair groups. And more importantly, they just never failed in the past, even when they got unfair groups. So even when Katie Rolster got that ultra bullshit group of LGD, TSM, and Orion, they still made it out. They still made it out in first place, in fact. That's how ridiculous Koreans are generally. So it's just that in the past, they were so insanely dominant at the game that the format couldn't even hold them back, whereas format can definitely skew the results and who ends up where overall in this sense. So let's go team by team and talk about these squads and consider some of the flaws they had. So Gen.G obviously was an absolute fucking joke at this tournament. The idea they were representing Korea and they were even the reigning world champions is pathetic when you look at how they actually played and their final placing. But you look at them over this year and last year, and there is a pattern there, which is in the LCK, specifically in the summer, they show themselves to be like solid, decent enough. At times they were better in 2017. They weren't quite as good in 2018. But they get to the playoffs. In the playoffs, they're weak. They're a team that's never, with this core, made a single LCK final. Despite the fact they've been in 2 Worlds finals, won one of them and went to Game 5 in the other one. So it shows that in some weird tournament format that isn't LCK, they somehow are much better. But then in LCK itself, they're never the #1 ranked team in the regular season. And in the playoffs, they do basically jack shit. Who knows why? It's just the way it goes. So famously weak in the playoffs. But you get them into that gauntlet, you get them into Worlds in the past, they get that buff, right? Funnily enough, in getting through the gauntlet, they always deny a team who you would think themselves, if they got to Worlds, would do much better at Worlds than they did in LCK. So Katie Rolster of the past years, with that many all-star players and playing the macro style against Western teams who weren't as good at it, you have to figure in 2017 they could have done real damage at that Worlds, but they didn't get to go. This year, Griffin looked like such a phenomenal team when we had that weird meta switch in the summer. Seemed like even a very, very strong team in the playoffs. Obviously, were close to winning LCK themselves. It's not even like they were completely a joke in the gauntlet, even though, yes, obviously disappointing to lose to Gen.G. This is another squad who you think also could have done so much at this Worlds, and in fact, I think would have adapted so very well. Then you think about this. Gen.G always a team that lived off their late game strengths. That was pretty much the style that they survived on. Hence why when they kept putting Harrow in for early game jungling, it didn't work. And they couldn't do well in the early game. Therefore, the late and mid game was wasted. When they would go with ambition, they couldn't get much going early. But in past metas, like last year, they were able to get it to the mid game, to the late game. RNG trained them in that sense by beating 10 tons of shit out of them when they were in the group stage last Worlds. And that put them in a position where they could then use some of those advantages to exploit even the likes of now Kingzone, then Longju when they were at Worlds there. That fucked them hard for this Worlds though, because that seemed to be the exact opposite style from what every successful team did at this Worlds, and they could never get to that point anyway, so it was irrelevant as to whether they could have done anything late game. We never really got to see that properly from this squad. Then you go to Afrika Freaks. Now, Afrika Freaks looked legit the whole time back in Korea. They always looked very, very solid. Part of it that's definitely helped is, for some bizarre reason, they were one of the few teams when Kingzone was very good that matched up really well against them, actually. Could really take the game to them, win games, potentially win series against them, could even perhaps have won the spring finals, you can make the argument. Now, to be fair, Afrika Freaks, anytime they stepped foot internationally or outside of LCK, didn't look actually like they had the kind of swagger and the confidence you expect from a top Korean seed that's supposed to have a chance to, if not win Worlds, go very, very deep in it and beat everyone in best of 5 seeds. They didn't have that. They looked fragile this whole tournament. Even in some of their wins, which they definitely dusted a few teams off, they still had a few moments that were a bit shaky there. Then you look at them as a team. Now, they're a team where you could argue some of their big strengths are in that bot lane. Because, yes, Keen was a very good top laner, but it wasn't playing a carry top style generally in the LCK. Then you look at Kuro. Again, not a dominant mid laner, a very good mid laner, very good control mid laner, potential MVP candidate. Then you go and look at their jungler. When they put Spirit in, he's more of a late game jungler. He's someone who's going to farm up. They put Mowgli in sometimes to get early game action, but the bot lane was where it was at for Afrika Freaks. They were a team that had, obviously, one of the MVP candidates to the tournament beyond Kuro, and earlier in the year was Tussin, the support player. You think of a guy who can really make a lot happen. Then you have Kramer, a guy who wants to just go balls deep all day long, who wants you to load up all the gold in him and wants to just be that mad teamfight carry. None of that worked here. Look at the teams that made the semis, okay? Invictus Gaming, the entire time they've existed, by the way, even going back to Season 5, based around strong solo laners. Fnatic, this is, in fact, I actually think Invictus Gaming's solo laners were underrated as much as everyone rated Rookie super highly, and then acted like Duke's shit, and the Shy's like way better. I personally think Duke's the better player and fits the team better. Then you have Fnatic. Okay, they have the options to where they go, but Reckless seems very much since coming back to a team have settled into like, right, I'll just be there for the team fights, dude. Like, yeah, you guys run the game if you want. If they have Whipple, they run carries. Even Soaz is a very, very strong top laner. Obviously, they have caps, so they can play solo laners if they want and be emphasized around them. Cloud9, you could argue the solo laners are the best players in this team. Licorice did so much for them. Jensen's always been a very, very good player, and I think the whole golden glue thing kicked him up his arse a bit and got him into gear, especially because he knew there wouldn't be any golden glue as a sub at this tournament, and he's always performed at Worlds, to be honest. Then you look at G2. G2 the whole time this year has been about the solo laners. The Perks and Wonder are the best thing about that team by a country mile. Sure, Jankos has come along in the second half of the year a bit more and got his shit together, but Wonder as a top laner has been a revelation in Europe playing for this team, contrasted to the last one, and Perks has always been a beast. So coming into a meta where it wasn't as much about bot lane, and they had a utility bot lane anyway, what a fucking dream this is. This is like the best scenario. So you look at the teams there, It's not like all these teams like outperformed the others, outpracticed them all, came up with a genius read on the meta. If anything, the meta has played right into the hands of most of these teams. Then you look at the teams that are late game team fighting teams, that are teams that play all the time through the bot lane, that are teams waiting for like mid-game vision-based decision and jungle pathing to win them the game. They're not fucking non-existent. They haven't made it deep in this tournament. So you want to congratulate the teams that made it. Yes, you played to your conditions as well as possible. But it's clear that for a team like a Freak of Freaks, yeah, you just weren't in a good position for this tournament, mate. And actually, I have to say, as strong as all those players looked in Korea, they weren't as versatile as we thought. They were versatile as much as I Love Oof could come up with some crazy strats. He could do something bizarre or an interesting composition, but they couldn't just flex all over the map. They weren't actually like, believe it or not, a Fnatic in that sense. It's one of the reasons why when me and Loco did that episode about Greatest Western Team, for me it was so clear it was Fnatic Season 8. I know they haven't yet got on and won Worlds or made finals, but the level of like star players, the sub option that we never truly had in the West, the versatility, the ability to play seemingly multiple styles inside the game. I think they're the only team of the four that are left, quite frankly, who don't have to just play this World's meta, can mix it up a little bit, and I think that gives them an extra strength, actually. Then we'll go look at KT Rolston. Now, KT Rolston, #1 seed from Korea. This was the real disappointment. They didn't go further. But, let's be real. First of all, they got Invictus Gaming. And Invictus Gaming, first of all, the meta has suited them fabulously. Secondly, they're a team that has seemingly the best player in the tournament in Rookie. And then you've got to add in, thirdly, they're a squad who, if anything, want to play this style, have practiced around playing this style, aren't wanting to get into these super late game team fights, aren't wanting to have a big macro fest. They're fucking loving it. That's a perfect team to go against KT. KT's never been that great a team at adapting. Now, they've always been a strong team. This year, when they got UCAL, who could hold mid, now they could really unleash the strengths because they plugged the hole. My analogy for UCAL is he like plugs the bath, and now all those 4 taps that are going off inside the bath, I guess 3 and then scores like the guy making sure they're all turned on, are going to make the bath overflow. You're going to get all the quantity you want, right? So the real Team Liquid, in that sense, not a bad analogy, I might work that into a show sometime, mental note. So they were the best team in the summer, throughout the regular split, in the playoffs when it mattered, won the split, great. They've got like an all-star team, basically. I mean, at this point, since UCAL's looking better and better, I wouldn't say, yeah, he's the best Korean mid, but everyone else is pretty much the best at their role. I think you could make a very strong case. Like, I know before Worlds, you could have made some solid case for some of the Afrika players. Obviously, earlier in the year, the Kingzone players. But right now, they look like they have the best Korean players. But they never were that adaptive a team. They always tried to fit the game through their own view of the game, seemingly Matters' view of the game. They still, I mean, UCAL came in and by plugging the hole, solved a lot of the problems of like, now what happens in terms of like Port was a liability, but Smeb's already demanding the jungler, and then bot lane's demanding the jungler. Now at least there's one less lane that the jungler has to go to. There's a self-sufficient player there overall. But you never quite got into the position where you could use all these amazing tools and do any style in the game. That was never there, even though you would have hoped it would. This is a team that always tried to, through their own way and through their own fighting style, snowball the game, would overextend, and so they either smashed your head in, or they would make the key mistakes that let you back in the game, and when you could play more macro, that's when teams could punish KT Rolster, hence famously why Gen.G was actually sort of their kryptonite, especially in playoff/gauntlet scenarios, where people tend to play a bit more conservatively and don't want to go as hyphy generally in the LCK. I've always thought it's one of the reasons the LCK playoffs plays out very differently to seemingly every other tournament, including Worlds. Hence, Gen.G, KSV, Samsung's success at Worlds, but not in the LCK playoffs. Now, obviously, the bizarre and disappointing thing about KT is they still have all the pieces in this team right now, where why couldn't they have adapted and then beaten everyone with all these players? Why couldn't they have played through top and mid lane? Now, that's a question I'd have for someone like LS. If UCAL's so strong, why not adapt, play through the solo laners like so many other teams did, and dominate the game? I would suggest he's not, he is, my joke of he's the Korean pole belt, and there's a special joke on the fact that Koreans obviously, that pole belt is obviously ethnically Korean, is that's not the play you want to play through. Now, yes, you could definitely play through Smeb, but even then, your jungler hasn't been like, I just go top all the time for Smeb, as much as a team jungler as it is. It's like if you took Smithy and told him, right, only ever gank for the top lane. It's not really going to be that effective in your team generally, is it? So it's not going to play to his strengths as a jungler. So I get why they weren't able to do it. With that said, their failure was overblown. Invictus Gaming has looked very strong here. Might yet go on to win Worlds. They didn't lose any games to Western teams at this Worlds. They lost to Invictus Gaming and they lost 1 game to EDG. That's it. So that's not as terrible as people make out, even though, yes, the placing is shit. But then again, they got one of the hardest... In fact, I'm going to go ahead and say it. They got the hardest #2 seed in the entire tournament. Remember, they could have had G2. They could have had Cloud9, or they could have had EDG. And now, obviously, in this setting, they couldn't have had... who was in their group? Katie Rolster. They couldn't have had EDG, so they could only have had Fnatic, Cloud9, or IG. Now, no, not Fnatic. They could have only had IG, fucking hell, IG, G2, or Cloud9. Now, of those three, the hardest to get, let's be real, is fucking IG. And I think IG will go on to prove that. So they got the hardest draw, to be fair. And the rest of the Korean teams have fucked shit up on their own. So that now it makes Korea look terrible that the best team got the hard draw and didn't get through. With that said, move on from that. Now let's look at the fact that the meta obviously was something that went heavily against the Koreans. Now, remember, whenever I make these points, I am but a layman trying to apply things I know from other esports games, things I know about the history of this esport, but I don't go in depth on the picks. I don't know everything about all the comps and the win conditions. This is, again, but a layman's opinion. Now, I will say, one thing that I found very impressive is that when you want to talk about the meta, look at what Cloud9 did. So... whenever I watched Cloud9 in the past, this iteration and past iterations under Reapered, they always seemed to try and play what people would dub the Korean style, which is more based around getting vision, having good, strong vision advantage in the mid-game, knowing the pathing of the enemy jungler, using vision to actually pick off mistakes, set up your late game, and hopefully be able to win properly with macro, with rotations, and get the right team fights, bait the Baron, etc. In this kind of a world, I actually thought Reapered was doing a fairly good job doing that. It's a coaching style he probably took from the Koreans, obviously, and how the Koreans were generally being successful. And I actually thought, by the way, that's one of the reasons, underrated reasons, to why Cloud9 always did well at Worlds, but weren't the best in NA. Because in NA, there are players who have the player strength to actually beat them and play very well in that sense, TSM being a famous example. But then you go to Worlds, TSM collapses where they're playing players as good or better than them, and therefore that brute force laning style doesn't work, whereas Cloud9's macro drilled style actually can punish mistakes from some of the lesser teams at Worlds, can get you potentially a chance at an upset over a Chinese team that's seeded higher than you, but isn't as good in that particular respect. So I thought in that respect it worked. Well, the great thing is, Reapered seemed to make a really smart choice at this Worlds and realise, maybe because of the group he's in with Gen.G and RNG, like it's a waste of time doing that style. We're just going to be inferior players doing a similar style. We're not going to win. So fuck it, let's go into this style. Them and Vitality really adopted this mentality of like, let's play earlier game focused, let's play around the solo lanes, let's give people like Licorice a chance to carry, let's just fucking go for it, shall we? And obviously that ended up being fabulous overall for them. So one of the few coaches I can say did take a team that previously would have played a different way and funnel them towards a style that actually made sense for this meta, which was weird for this tournament, because I don't think there was that much adaptation at this tournament for most of the teams, quite frankly. I think the meta decided a lot of it. Then you look at the fact that with teamfight strength seemingly rendered useless, as in you're going to get so many kills before, people can push advantages earlier, people can group earlier. In this kind of a world, again, one of Korea's traditional strengths or ways of seeing the game was somewhat neutralized, was inhibited, was limited at least a little bit. Because one of the Korean strengths throughout many games, I've often pointed this out, is learning by the correct route, the right way to play. Principles of the game that you follow like a flow chart, and then you know that this counters this, and this is what should follow, and this is the correct response, even if you're behind in a game and someone does this, to keep the margins very close. In that kind of a world, they do fantastically. They beat out everyone who's trying to copy them and mimic their style in that sense. But they have always had the hardest times with people who deviate from that. Hence, who are the people who got big wins over Korean teams? OMG at Season 3. You have versus the RNG late game style. Then you go and you look OMG over Naji and Shield at Season 4. You go and look at the Flash Wolves teams beating out Coup, beating SK Telecom at events. Teams who deviate, especially teams who play a very aggro early style, people who don't follow the rules, who do ganks at times that to you don't make sense, who set up players to carry the game, but not in a vision control style. These are the teams that were able to disrupt the Koreans, have a chance at upsets, and eventually score upsets. That's why the best example ever, I always said this, people should have been studying these guys from Season 6 on, is how the fuck were the Flash Wolves getting those upsets? That was a blueprint right there to beating Korean teams, even when the meta suited Korean teams. It's just teams didn't follow it and didn't do what they saw there. Funnily enough, even teams like GAM were able to actually take an extreme version of that with even worse players and have a crack at doing some big upsets. But for some reason in the West, everyone kept thinking, because they had the coaches and babbling on about infrastructure, that they were ever going to beat Koreans playing basically the way Koreans play and just copying things from Koreans that they didn't necessarily understand. Now, I will say, historically, one of the reasons why this shouldn't be as much of a surprise, even though it's a massive surprise what's happened at this Worlds, is that League of Legends as a game never made that much sense to me, outwardly, as to why Koreans would dominate it until I looked into the context. Because actually, it's such a simplistic game in many ways. It was so by the numbers, on the rails, as it were, in terms of how the macro played out, how vision worked out, how pathing worked out. There weren't that many choices, in contrast to games like CSGO, which can be very dynamic, allow a lot of playing styles, different metas of Dota that have sometimes allowed you to have a lot of play, many different playing styles, many different strengths you could emphasize on the map. League of Legends often did have to be played through a certain lane, through a certain set of champions, through a certain style of top lane, a certain style of mid lane, a certain style of jungler, depending on what happens. And those hard meta switches just threw people one way or the other in the wind. And some people went on to fortune, some people went on to ruin. And sometimes it wasn't even just about them, their players, the practice they had and how they constructed their team. There were elements that were out of their hands. But that always showed me how insane the Korean work ethic is, how amazing their ability to break down the game is, and to make it into constituent parts, understand those parts, reassemble it, and therefore practice most efficiently. Because in a game that was so strict and was so skewed in many ways, it actually ended up, as a result, really suiting a system-style approach. One that, by the way, Koreans have always loved. It's how they run everything, including their businesses, including their families. But actually, Westerners don't embrace. You could argue have never embraced, possibly since like the feudal era. I mean, this is getting a bit of a fucking digression here, so I'll probably leave that for another video. Westerners in the modern day, they're too individualistic. They're too given to the notion of play, of doing things spontaneously in the game, having an impulse and following that intuition, as opposed to what the correct way would be. That in the past, those divergent philosophies or approaches to the game kept Korea on top, along with some very good players and a great infrastructure, and kept Westerners from being able to challenge them. In this meta, where all of a sudden there weren't the same strict rules, and both aspects could have been emphasized, but as a result, allowing a lot of the early game shit meant that Westerners could go ham, the ones who understood that, crucially, and almost everyone swapped to that at this point, and you got lucky with some of the teams who went to Worlds. I don't think it's a coincidence that Team Liquid, easily the best NA team, who didn't have any of those abilities or strengths or ability to play around the solo laners or to play the early game style, they weren't able to do absolutely anything at this Worlds. 100 Thieves had a bunch of good players, even with the Codison scenario. They were a team that was so boring, based around all that mid-game garbage, couldn't get those early leads, and as a result, what do you know? They couldn't do anything at Worlds either. They couldn't swap to the solo lane. So it says a lot about where we're at as a game, right? Then you've got to add in, one final issue is the format. They did change the format this year, and I did point out, actually, that cynically, you could even say, if Riot wanted to give Westerners a better chance, this format's it. Because first of all, there is no week 2. You just play all through week 1. It's just a really long 8-day week, basically. So there's less time to adapt between series for different teams. Then you got the factor that the gap between end of groups and the beginning of the quarterfinals used to in the past be like a week, something along those lines, sometimes because you had to swap countries. That week, my old joke used to be that the real gap between all the best Western teams and even Asian teams and Korean teams is that week. That's the gap. It's the 1 week gap. Well, guess what? Riot did shorten that gap. So there was less time to practice. There was less time to practice with a specific opponent who could mimic your opponent in this match. There was less time to gather information from all the games. There was less time to get a team back in Korea who's good to practice against you in that particular way, secretly come up with a lot of inventive shit. I think teams like Afrika Freaks, that hurt a lot because they were used to being able to scrim internally and do a lot of creative things. They even said they were scrimming a lot, but still 20 hours a day over 2 or 3 days ain't the same as having a whole week, homie, especially not when you've got subs and all these different angles you could take, but you haven't got the time for it. So I think that actually did help Western teams as well. They could kind of like strike while the iron's hot still, instead of getting cooled down over a week where they don't adapt much, they don't learn much, they keep trying to do the same things, and the Koreans get ahead again or close any kind of a gap that there was, if there indeed had been one, or extend one. Then you got to look at this. So now let's look at LCK for a second, because LCK is no joke. Like the idea that like, cause these teams failed, LCK is in massive trouble. No. First of all, the meta swap hurt them big time. It hurt the traditional paradigm / framework they had of playing around vision, slowly using opponent advantages to crush opponents, just setting up a perfect, correct way to play that punished every mistake, and you almost won by default in some senses. That's a very simplistic way of describing it. I'm trying to use a very broad stroke for all Korean teams and like 4 or 5 years of League of Legends, for fuck's fuck's sake. But that is always what Korean teams are the best at, late game decision making. Then you consider who was back at home in Korea. Kingzone Dragon X, Griffin. Now Griffin, absolutely, this is a team that could have done fucking a lot of shit at this tournament. They're fucked because of the circuit point situation, so they couldn't get to Worlds. Kingzone, I know people want to meme on them because how they played at Rift Rivals and at MSI. You look at the strength of their players and you look at the fucking solo laners, Khan and BDD, and then you add in a jungler like Peanut. These boys could have gone hog wild at this Worlds if they'd have gotten here. Now, they couldn't get here. They weren't good enough in the playoffs. They fallen off way too much. They couldn't do shit in the gauntlet. Yeah, they weren't a team that could get here. But in a world in which somehow they had, I think they would have gone absolutely ham here. And what you've seen from some of the Western teams, they would have done as well and been very, very strong actually overall. Obviously, they even had the bot lane to support top lane carries even earlier in the year when no one else really played fully top lane carry style. Obviously, they had Khan to do that with. I even think some of their failures internationally might have actually gotten them prepared to get over whatever mental issues they had and be fucking beasts at this tournament. Now, there's also, beyond those teams, some very solid talent. Like, people still don't realise this who don't watch Jinnair or LCK, because, by the way, Jinnair is not one of the best teams in LCK. Teddy from Jinnair legit is probably a top 3 AD carry in the world. That's how good this guy is. Put him on fucking SK Telecom. Put him on a Freak of Freaks. This guy will do work. He is fucking amazing. Faker is obviously still back at home on SK Telecom. Yeah, he had a bad year. There was a lot of problems. I still think if you put that guy in a very good team, he goes fucking ham. The Rocks Tigers actually took a bunch of players that don't have big name value, but looked very solid at times, even played well as a team. Now, add in this. This meta won't last forever. It's not like Riot actually very cynically were able to reverse engineer a meta that would make the teams from the West do well at Worlds. No, they locked into it. And they locked into it, as usual in Riot fashion, by designing something to work one way, then finding out it isn't applied that way at all, and therefore you actually don't get the game that you designed. You didn't design shit, you just made a change, and it had a bunch of effects. So I think they locked into us anyway, and therefore I'm not worried that they're going to be able to craft the next meta to be like this and help the Western teams. I don't really think that's the case. I also am not that cynical that I think Riot are evil and purposely do try to just make the Western teams win. I don't think that's the case. I could believe they want to make it more exciting and that they want players to do very well, and that's why they've had Assassins buffs before Worlds and Juggernaut buffs before Worlds and a bunch of different things like that. Sure, I could believe that to some degree. But you've got to consider, every meta in the history of League of Legends, Koreans have adapted to and eventually thrived within. So if you kept this meta going for another year, I've no doubt they would. Same would be the case there. They'd break the game down. They'd rebuild their new model paradigm for how the game works. They'd reshuffle a bunch of players. They'd get all their practice in. They'd have the international tournaments before Worlds. And they would be extremely strong next Worlds, even in this type of a meta. I think what happens now is they go home. Again, you have some shuffles. You have some players who didn't make it. You have some coaches who maybe get fired. But eventually, you do adjust your paradigm. You adjust your practice approach. You probably heavily prac LPL teams for the time being since they've outperformed you generally. You try to get good against this style and integrate it into whatever the next meta is early next year, and you become the best region again, clearly. I don't think, quite frankly, as well, one vast detail is one area I thought Korea used to have a big advantage was this great use of subs they had. Now, sure, Cloud9, Fnatic have been flexing that at this tournament, but this is a team where, this is a tournament where, because they needed to switch up their style, they could have made so much better use of these junglers. Like, why didn't all these teams have a good early game jungler? Gen.G had Haru, who's never worked with their team. A Freak of Freaks had Mowgli, who admittedly is good, but I actually think Spirit's the better jungler, and they're sort of a bit more limited when they have to use Mowgli. KT has Rosh, technically, on the bench. I don't know if they took him to Worlds as a sub. They used him briefly in the spring. I would have had him available on deck to go for when I've got to just play games that have a go button from moment one. Even though Score's the better jungler, I think that could have suited it and definitely could have disrupted how your opponents played at times. At least throw him in for the odd game, right? This is an aspect where, in the past, I think Koreans would have done a better job with. Then again, they couldn't have anticipated how crazy this meta would be, right? You've got to finally talk about, yes, from past Worlds, one of the problems with all those great performances and those great records is there was the SK Telecom skew, where 3 of those Worlds titles go to one team, 4 finals appearances go to one team. Like, yeah, you know what? It had affected teams before that, in my opinion, what happened is, not only was SK Telecom so dominant and so clutch, and so people thought that's what Koreans were like, and then people also thought SK Telecom's late game vision style, based around having a weak jungler and a vacuum pressure vacuum and faker mid, mad OP advantage, and then a bevy of fucking like rotating Dwarf god tier top laners. I do think that skewed how people thought of their teams and affected how people thought of the Korean style. But I also think it actually helped some of the other Korean teams. They also thought Korea's invincible. Like, oh, we can't beat SK Telecom, but you know what? We're the closest thing to SK Telecom, so fuck it, we're Korea, right? Because you look, they still had very few losses in best of 5 from anyone else, even outside of SK Telecom. You basically just had the Najin Shield OMG one, right? Aside from that, it's only Koreans beating Koreans. So I think some of that mental frame did get cracked. Like, I think Royal Never Give Up cracked the aura because Kingzone came in so dominant. They were supposed to be the next SK Telecom, and they got their shit pushed in MSI, and everyone was like, holy shit, if the best Chinese team can go straight head-to-head with the best Korean team and beat them, not with those clauses of the EDG one from SK Telecom a few years back, this is possible, right? Maybe they're not as strong as you think. Then you had that Group B with Vitality, Royal Never Give Up, C9, Gen.G. That was another game changer because every other team in the tournament watched that and was like, Jesus Christ, if you just play super aggro and this shit works against these top Asian teams, Korean and Chinese, why isn't anything possible? Let's go for it, right? In fact, you could make a case. Vitality, in some ways, died sacrificing themselves to give a blueprint for how you could actually play against some of the top Asian teams, including the previously unbeatable superior Koreans. Now, there are some scene concerns for Korea. Like, I actually think personally, even before this Worlds, they needed to kick up the arse for all of this year. SK Telecom was chilling while they got superseded, not buying better players. And literally getting superseded at times, by the way, by like Jin-Air, Rocks, Tigers, like teams that weren't even top-level teams. Top teams getting dominated by Kingzone looked a bit lackluster when you then saw Kingzone fall apart. Griffin, still a very hungry team, waiting for their chance. They got fucked out because they didn't play in spring because they only got promoted after spring, so they couldn't do the circuit point aspect. They were inexperienced, so they lost Game 5 to some veterans and Hall of Famers in KT Rolster, and then they didn't get through the gauntlet where for some bizarre reason Gen.G always got the gauntlet buff. So yes, this was the worst Worlds for Korea, but there's a lot more context to it that even the layman from outside can see. And I'm not particularly worried for Korea, quite frankly. Like, it's not like this meta is going to continue and everything we learned here is going to carry over to next Worlds necessarily. I think if anything, we've awoken a sleeping giant, and now Korea comes back even stronger next year and starts dominating again. This video was kindly supported by Andreas, Snazore, Westerlund, Dean Tanglis, Gardner Wilson, Landon Thompson, NateDOhDoubleG, Kyla Harris, Travis Greb, James Harding, Daniel Yordanov, VeXii, Robert Baxter, and a special thanks goes out as always to Jerky's Minion. Do you want to suggest a topic or a guest for my content? Would you like to ask me a question in my monthly AMA? Would you fancy a few teasers for what's coming up in my content? How about taking part in an esports discussion with me? We'll put your money where your mouth is and join the Scrilluminati today at the Patreon link in the description box below.